Hi, my name is Justin Siegel. I'm going to be doing a presentation on the 22nd Amendment. So, as the name suggests, the 22nd Amendment is the 22nd Amendment to the United States Constitution, and it was ratified in 1951. Um, the basics of this amendment, has two clauses. The first clause is the premise of the entire amendment, which is, in essence, that no single person will be elected to the United States presidency more than twice. That's two terms or 8 years, as we learned through class. The second part of the first clause is that the vice president, if he serves the majority of a term, so if the president is shot or for whatever reason the vice presidency takes the presidency over, he- um, the vice president, if he serves more than 2 years in the first term, can only be reelected one more time. So he will have served what is pretty much the majority of one term and can only serve a second term. And the second part of the clause of this amendment is a time limit for the states in order for them to actually ratify this amendment. The committee only gave 7 years for um, a 2/3 of the states to ratify this amendment. So that leads us to a little bit of the history of where this amendment came from. So to talk about the premise of this amendment, we have to go back in time and talk about our first president ever, George Washington. Um, he George Washington took the presidency over after the United States Revolution, and he served his first term and was reluctantly given a second term. He kind of didn't want it, but he ended up taking it over, and by the time he was done, in his farewell address, he kind of made mention that he was done with the presidency, that if he continued on, he would be kind of creating the same thing that they just fought against, which is a monarchy. He believed that the he believed that the 8 years that he had just served would be enough, and that switching leadership for the presidency was actually pretty important. So he stepped down after the second term. This tradition was carried on with Sam Adams and Thomas Jefferson, and it can be argued that George Washington's start, he just set precedent, and the following presidents kind of made it the tradition. But George Washington was the first one to initially just do 2 terms. So um, it wasn't ever law until we get to um, FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Um, so just a little bit about FDR. He is the distant cousin to Theodore Roosevelt, who had actually tried and unsuccessfully ran for a third term. Along with there was one other candidate who tried but failed. His name is Ulysses S. Grant. So back to Franklin Delano Roosevelt. He was first elected in 1932. Kind of in the midst of the Great Depression. And for those of you who don't know, the Great Depression was a very serious economic depression that the United States was going through. It started, I believe, in 1929 or 1930. So he was elected 2 years into this, and the nation was kind of in shambles, for to sum it up. People were living in shanty towns. There was very high unemployment. These shanty towns were actually called Hoovervilles, which were kind of a slant at the previous president, Herbert Hoover, who kind of failed at helping them. So that's why FDR was actually elected, because of his promise to help. Um, so he was elected to fix the problem, as I just said. So he started enacting programs to fix the the state at which the United States was in. He created two things: the New Deal and the Second New Deal, which were pretty much government programs like the WPA, the Workmen's Program, Social Security, and a lot of other safety nets. So things like the Great Depression couldn't happen again. And he was elected again um, in 1936 because of the success of these programs. He had, I believe it was a 60% or so approval rating compared to Herbert Hoover's, who was pretty low. Um, so after that, in 1936, the next election was the unprecedented third term, which was in the 1940s. The reason for that, and the reason that he ran for re-election, was because the United States was still kind of in the midst of the Great Depression. He had set up um, these new programs to help the Americans, and really the candidate that was running against FDR was described as kind of a third-rate candidate. Um, Obviously, the opposing party thought that this was like not okay. They were completely against a third-term presidency, saying that was a threat to the democracy. But FDR actually ended up winning solely based on the fact that um, he pledged to keep the United States out of the war, the World War II, which was currently going on at the time. It had just started, and he wanted to keep the United States out because we had previously, within the last 20 years, or 30 years, had just gotten out of the First World War. So he was pretty much completely against going back into another war. And he successfully gained the third term because of this. Unfortunately, as we all know, Pearl Harbor happened, and the United States sentiment swung, and we ended up in the World War, which is actually a reason that FDR had gained another unprecedented fourth term. He died shortly into this fourth term, but he gained this fourth term because of the situation, the exigent circumstances. There was a Great Depression on top of a World War happening, a very serious war, and the United States people saw FDR as a strong leader. So that goes into the only person who had ever gained a third and fourth term. Shortly after FDR died, however, the United States people, or the Congress, decided that this was not to happen again, and so they set up and eventually passed the 22nd Amendment. So, moving forward, this picture that we are now looking at is a picture of the states and how they voted. So as we look at the dark green, those are the first states, and as we progressively get lighter and lighter, those are the states that voted later. So in 1947, we had, I believe it was 18 states that voted in favor of this amendment. In 1948, we had two. We had 2 more states join into that. In 1949, we had, I believe it was 1 state. 1950, we had 2 more states. And in 1951 were the final amount of states, which I believe was 17. We had 2 states that voted completely against it, and they're listed in yellow. That would be Oklahoma and Connecticut, I believe. And there were 5 states that just did not vote at all, and you can see them in gray listed on the map. Hawaii and Alaska are not included in this, so there were only 48 states because at the time Alaska and Hawaii were not states. So with that said, that leads us to it's just some court cases, some case law that I found. There were not very many case laws that I could actually find on this. So the only one that I found was Inc v. Thornton, which the case is pretty much, it's a case out of Arkansas. The Arkansas people wanted to, or the Arkansas legislator wanted to put a restriction on how many, they wanted to put additional restrictions for the representatives and senators from Arkansas, but the judgment was that this was eventually considered unconstitutional because the United States Constitution is what kind of dictates the representative and senator like term limits and the restrictions, and it was ruled that like the United States Constitution is like the supreme doctrine. So the United States Supreme Court ruled at 5-4 that the terms that Arkansas were saying were unconstitutional. And that leads us to my final thing about, I initially mentioned on the first slide that the legal scholars have argued that there is a loophole to the 22nd Amendment, and they have argued that the wording specifically for the amendment simply says that a person cannot be elected to the presidency, or a vice president cannot take over or cannot be elected again if he had already served for 2 terms. Or, sorry, a vice president had served 1 term and then was a term again, but specifically, it does not say, or it was not covered, that if a presidential candidate, so let's say in recent years Obama had served his 2 terms, it does not say in the amendment doesn't cover if he were to run as the vice presidency for somebody, and for whatever reason that person then gets, like let's say Obama is the vice president of Bernie Sanders, and because Bernie Sanders is old, it would not be unreasonable to believe that he may pass in office. And if that was the case, the next person in line to become the president, as we learned, is the vice president. However, the vice president has already served 2 terms, but he would be able to take over the presidency. Or maybe he wouldn't, because that situation is very, it would be, 1, it's very outlandish, and 2, it's kind of unrealistic. However, that is a theoretical loophole to the 22nd Amendment. And that's kind of about it, and I'm at my 15-minute mark, so thank you.